Let's take a look how we can use clean assets from Unreal Engine and turn them into something a little bit more weathered in Substance Painter. Here's a great example of it. This is a Quixel asset that looks clean, very pristine. Look at all the nice surface detail here, but it's a little bit too clean for the scene that we're building. So I turned it into something like this. So while this might be a little bit over the top, you can easily trim this down, and I'll do all that in Substance Painter. While you could add decals for some of these effects, decals only get you so far, and they have a limited range really, because they're all projections and they're all from one side only, and they usually don't have color variation in this amount of detail in it. So this is really where Substance Painter shines, and Substance Painter is a little bit intimidating, but I'll talk you through it, and if I can do it, so can you. Just for reference, this is the asset I'm using for this, the modular building window, and of course I'm using Substance Painter. Let's have a quick look at the layer stack before I go and explain how to export the asset out from Unreal Engine, how to export the materials, bring them into Substance Painter so that we have the base material, and then we add these layers on top of it. So from the top, then, this is sort of the last layer that gets displayed here. That's the rain damage. If I switch it on and off, you see what that particular layer does. So it's almost imperceptible. If it wasn't there, you might think, hey, that's already weathered enough, but it's always about the little variations that add a little bit more detail. I've made myself a black dummy layer here just to essentially mute whatever's underneath the layer stack. So this isolates what this exact layer does here. So that's what it does, that's what it adds. In fact, it was, I think, one effect. This was similar to a decal that I've overlaid there, but it wasn't strong enough, so I just duplicated it, and then it makes that effect a little bit stronger there. Then the next one here is the little green tinge. If we were to isolate that without this, then this is what it looks like, just green. So this is another filter or a generator that we're going to add there. Then we have the worn material. This is something else. This is essentially the base material with a slight color adjustment, with a levels adjustment, and then we're just going to bleed some of these things through. And if you have multiple of these arches in a row, you probably don't want them to all look the same. So I'll show you how to make a few subtle variations that you have 3 or 4 different types of textures that you can use for that. And then just to leave all the rest of the bits and pieces on here, we've got some dirt that is only applied to the window and the windowsill, and then another one that is essentially the same thing that is only applied to the wall, only because the strength was very different there. And then to switch all of these things up, we have the base material that we see inside of Unreal Engine, and on top of that we're going to layer bits and pieces up. So let's get started and see how to do all this with Unreal Engine and Substance Painter. The first thing in Unreal Engine that we need to do is to figure out where the asset actually is. So select it so that it comes up, and then on the details panel, head over into the static mesh section or the skeletal mesh section if you have one of those, and then click on the little folder icon to display it in your content browser. So I've already imported it here. It shows up. Usually what I like doing is to put the textures into one folder, maybe put the material into another. They haven't done that because it comes from the Quixel bridge, but that's fine. We know this is the static mesh, and this one here we need to export so we can import it into Substance Painter. So right click and head over to Asset Actions, and then head over to Export. That gives us a couple of format options. Let me go and make a new folder on my desktop. I'll call it Dirty Wall Demo. And at the bottom here under Save Type, it probably defaults to FBX depending on how it was imported. Those can cause some issues in Substance Painter, or OBJs can also cause issues in Substance Painter. Let's go and choose OBJ because that is a little bit more reliable. If an export dialog opens at this point, make sure you don't enable the collision because that's a second mesh that gets added and we don't really need that. Next, we want to go and export these textures here. So while we do have 3 physical textures, the third one isn't something we want to use in Substance Painter. So let's just use the diffuse here and the normals texture. So select both of them, right click and head over to Asset Actions and Export. That'll export us PNGs or EXRs, and we can use the same folder that we had before here. Save that. So this means we can now go and import the asset as well as the textures into Substance Painter. Let's create ourselves a new project here. And under File, let's go and bring in the OBJ we've exported. So sometimes there's multiple when you export Quixel assets in particular. So pick the one that is larger, or look at both of them and see if there's a difference. Sometimes it's the back and the front of an object. So we're going to probably use the larger file size of that to get the most amount of detail in there. Document resolution, let's set that to 2K. And then at the bottom here under import baked maps, we're going to use this to bring in our 2 textures that we've exported. So click add and then go and pick both of these up. So that's the diffuse and that's the normal map here. Hit open, and then we're going to go and click OK down here, say discard because we don't want to save anything, and that's now our model brought in here. We're going to go and delete the paint layer that comes on the layers tab immediately and head over to my assets section and have a look at the imported assets. So these are them. So these have been recently imported, and this is exactly what we need. We can go and apply those directly to a new fill layer, but for that we need to make one first. So on the layers panel, click this little paint bucket icon here, and that creates us a new fill layer. So at the right here, you'll see, I'm going to take my face away just quickly. On the right, you can see all the channels that this is now open to let us make a change on, but we don't really want to do that. All we need is the color and the normal channel. So Alt select the color channel, and then that only leaves the color channel, and then click normal so that only the normal and the color channel are enabled here. So with this color picker, I could now go ahead and choose a different color for my wall. I don't really want to do that because I'm going to go and pick a map, and likewise for the normal color here, I can pick a color or I can put a texture into these things here. So under assets, I'm going to go and drag my diffuse map over to the base color like so, and that applies that here. And I'm going to drag my normal map over to my normal channel. And this is now the base material as I've seen it in Unreal Engine. So that's pretty cool. That's a good start. We have almost the same as what we saw in Unreal Engine, maybe without a roughness value. So maybe I'll go and adjust that as well. The wall is a little bit shiny for my liking. The roughness is part of the map that we had in Unreal Engine, but we don't have it in here, and that's fine. We're just for preview purposes. I'm going to go and select roughness here, and then I'll go and change the value of this. So once again, I could put a roughness map in here, or I can just go and change the value. As I shift it to the left, I'll make the color darker, it turns more shiny. And as I turn it to the right, it gets more, it gets a more dull thing here. So maybe 0.5 is going to be a good roughness value for my wall. I'm going to go and rename that by double clicking it and call that base material. And that means we can now go ahead and start doing some other stuff. So it's common that you go and bake the object in Substance Painter, and that lets it have a look at what it looks like from all angles. It lets it figure out where the top and where the bottom is and all that, which is important for some of the generators we're going to use. So click on that little croissant icon here, as I'd like to call it, and in here we can go and bake a map. It's only going to take a second. Output size, I would strongly recommend we set that to 4K or even higher. 4K is probably enough for this. This is just the size of the maps that are going to be baked. We probably need everything except for the ID map, so you can disable that, and all that is on the common settings tab here. Then with that in place, just click bake, select the textures, and then see Substance Painter hard at work. That's us done. Now we can go and return back to painting mode, and we see that our object looks a little bit different now, and that's probably because of the ambient occlusion. So some more detail appears to happen there. It's faked some shadows in the crevices, and our generators will be able to make use of that. Speaking of which, the generators, oh yeah, if ever you wanted to have a look at what these maps are, you can have a look over to assets and then switch over from all libraries to current project, and then you'll see all these things that have appeared here now. So this one is ours, this one is ours, but all the others Substance Painter is just created in the background and applied under the hood. So that is how it will be able to fake some of the magic that comes out. So the first thing I'd like to do is add some dirt in all these crevices. So basically enhancing what the baking process has already done with a new paint layer here. Much like before, I'm going to go and just focus on the base color, Alt select the color tab here so that we only have the base color, and pick a color for that. I'm going to just make it dark, something like that. That would be not completely black, but something like a dark gray. And this is essentially the color or the material that will appear where a wall has aggregated some dirt over time. So of course we don't want the whole wall to be black. We only want to reveal a little bit of black in the crevices. So to do that, we're going to go and create a mask with this object here, add a mask, in particular a black mask. So it fills the mask itself with black, meaning everything from the layer below will shine through, namely like that. So now we see as if nothing's happened. But the good thing is now inside the mask, I can now go and apply some changes. I can either go and paint with white to reveal the black, and that would be on top of that, or I can have a generator take care of that, which is sort of like a procedural thing that will reveal bits and pieces. So let's go and do that with this little icon at the top here, add effect. We're going to go and use a generator. So this is a little bit confusing to understand if you use Substance Painter for the first time. So this here is the actual material. The material has now got a mask applied to it, and inside of the mask we're going to go and make a change so that the mask will essentially reveal bits and pieces. So in the generator up here, we're going to go and put something in. If you click, then you can go and pick any of these things, but in particular, we're going to use the dirt generator. You can also go and look for it, search for it. Just click on dirt or search for dirt, and then you'll see these parameters here being populated. So at the bottom here, we can see that the generator is using some of the baked maps to create this magic. And just with one click, we already have a very dirty wall. And that's pretty cool, except for the wall might be a little bit too dirty, and the window has accumulated much more dirt than the rest of the wall. So we may have to go and split that up a little bit. First, let's go through some of these parameters up here. So image inputs, you don't really have to worry about. It's just, I'm going to close this down because it just confuses us otherwise. And Substance Painter is one of those things that it can cause a lot of confusion. So this happens on the properties tab here. In case your tabs look a little bit different, these are the properties here. And particularly under the parameters tab, you can go and fiddle with any of these sliders here, and they're pretty self-explanatory, so feel free to experiment a little bit. Seed is essentially the random number that this generates, or that is based on to generate its pattern. So if you click on that, you'll see a different randomization of the dirt. So this is a good way if you wanted to create 3 different or 4 different versions of this texture, just to click this, and then the next texture will look a little bit different. So I might go and leave something like this. Then the dirt level, if you slide that up and down, you see that the overall dirt increases or decreases. But that's just like how much dirt is applied. It doesn't necessarily change how it's applied. So dirt contrast will do that. It'll make the map that's applied there a little bit harder contrast or softer in contrast. Then there is something called use triplanar. You can switch that on or off. It's essentially how the maps are projected onto your object. It's one of those things that's trial and error is really what it does. False means it uses the UVs of the object, whereas triplanar enabled means it projects it from all sides. If you imagine this to be on the inside of a cube, and the cube projects this from all sides to it. Sometimes when the UVs don't look great, triplanar produces the better results. So I think it actually is the case on our wall. Maybe I'll use triplanar here, or if you like the larger splodges here, maybe I'll use false here. So then there's the grunge amount. That is changing how much of that detail is blended in here. And then we have the grunge scale as well. So if you want your dirt to be smaller or larger. So it really depends on the size of your object. So I might just go and do something like this as a nice starter. Maybe the dirt level is a little bit much. Dirt contrast also, maybe something like that. I'm just looking at the wall here. I'm thinking, what does the wall need in order to look great? So maybe this is good for our wall now. You can also go restore the defaults. If you fiddled with the slider so much that you want to go back, you can do that. I'm going to go and just stick with something like this for now. So the glaringly, or should I use the defaults? I might just use the defaults here, click on random a couple of times and increase the dirt level here a little bit and the dirt contrast. That's all I'm going to do here. So while the wall looks great, the window and all the bottom pillars here, they look way too strong. They would probably need just a lesser level, something like this. But if I apply that, then the wall doesn't look great. So that's something we're going to fix in a moment. Technically, our settings are nice, but they're only nice for the wall and not for the window. So let's go and apply this twice, once just to the wall and once just to the window. For that, let's go and put this whole layer into a group and then apply another mask on the group from which we can then go and remove one part or the other. So with this layer selected, hit Ctrl G. That is to group it, or right click on it. That's another possibility. Right click and choose group layer. That's the same way. You can sort of compartmentalize if you have multiple effects stacked on top of one another and you want to keep them together. That's what a group is used for. And in here, I'm going to go and apply another mask. And this time I'm going to apply a white mask. White means nothing really happens. There's a mask on there, but anything I'm going to paint out with black on the mask is now going to disappear, much like the black mask we've applied to this layer earlier. So in order to get rid of the window here, I'm going to go and zoom in a little bit and use our polygon fill tool on the left hand side here. It has a few options. This is a single triangle, this is a single polygon, this is the whole mesh fill, and this is a UV chunk fill. So that's probably what we want to use, UV chunk fill. I also have the color with which I want to paint in. So in my case, it's only going to be black and white. The mask itself is already white, so I'm going to go and paint with black and go and glide over here and reveal these bits that I don't want to have the effect applied here. Like that, and this is the window taken care of. No, actually the window, the mullions they also need to be blackened out with the mask. And maybe even, no, the arch is actually okay. The arch at the top is fine. But the window sill down here, I want to remove that as well. And all the pillars down here. And maybe this, actually, just this at the bottom here. The wall itself is fine. And maybe this as well. Yeah, I want to go and remove just that bit here. That seems to not be on UV. I'm going to go and use the polygon fill here. And just paint out these little bits and pieces. You can also switch over to the 2D view and then make these selections in the 2D view. I think that's probably, maybe not all of these things. Here, let me go and get rid of all that and have a slightly lesser effect at the bottom here. This one doesn't look so bad, but the other one sort of did. So this now, everything that we've just painted out here with the mask doesn't have the dirt effect on it. So let me go and duplicate this layer, this whole thing. I'm going to call this one here wall dirt. And then I'm going to go and duplicate the whole group, or click Ctrl D, that'll also work. And I'm going to call this one window dirt. And because it's now looks a little bit too strong because it's applied it twice, the effect twice. So what I want to do is use the mask that I've just painted and just invert it so that on my window dirt layer, only the window and the bottom pillar thing will get an effect and the wall will not. So right click on that mask here and go and say invert mask. And now we have that terrible black on our window again, but inside the folder on the mask of my black material, I can go and click on my dirt generator and then go and take the dirt level down a little bit, and that only has that effect on the window now. So this might be a little confusing if you're not used to what I just did there. There's basically 3 levels here. One is the folder that only has one material in there. The material is just the black stuff really, and the black stuff has a mask which now acts with the dirt generator with these parameters here. And because we've made another mask on top of the layer, this only applies to the window and not to the wall. Whereas if we go and open the wall layer and go to the mask for the dirt of the wall and select that dirt generator, we could go and make an adjustment just on the wall. So that's kind of cool. You can change your mind later if you, as you build these things up, you say, hey, maybe the wall needs a little bit less dirt or whatnot. That's already a good point here. So that is the dirt, and that's the first 2 layers of our stack. So the next thing I want to do is add a little bit of a leak sort of damage to it. So leaking as in, some streaks, like perhaps some moss has grown on this thing. So once again, we're going to make ourselves another fill layer on top of the whole stack here. That accidentally went to the wrong thing. So this wants to be at the very top of the stack now. And once again, we're going to Alt click color. So just reveal the color and then pick a nice color for the dirt. So in my case might be something a bit sort of green, not sort of toxic green, but something like a dark sort of moss green. And you can change that color later if you like. Maybe something like that would be good. And then once again, we don't want our wall to be green. We want it to be subtly green with bleed through. So let's go and add another black mask on it, masking everything out. And then we'll go and add another generator into this. And on that generator, we're going to go and select something called dripping rust. Dripping rust is going to look very nice, but there's tons of other generators that you can try out. So this is something that looks almost like what we want. The dripping is kind of funky because it recognizes that this is in fact a top-facing surface, so it won't apply down leaking streaks. It only applies that here, whereas here you have these splats, as if something's been leaking down on a wall but splatting down as it hits something like a surface like this. So that's how that works. For visualization, if you don't want to see your base material, you can either go and switch it off, or you can switch all these things off so that you can isolate just that layer. Or what I like doing is make another fill layer and just put that underneath and give that a color that emphasizes that contrast a little, just to blank out everything else that's underneath it. So I might call that one dummy layer, dummy layer, and then I can go and enable or disable it as I see fit. So once again, I only need the color. Alt selecting any of these will remove all the others and just leave that. So in my case, it's just the color, and I might go and give it something like black, because that means I can go and see what happens as I now adjust the dripping generator. I can just see a little bit better what's happening here. So once again, we have parameters on the properties tab here. We can have a random value once again. This is nice for variations, and you can have the rust spreading, like how much rust essentially goes on the wall, and you can have the rust contrast once again, so very similar to the dirt generator, and you can have the drips intensity if you want a little bit more leakage here, and you can also make it a bit smoother. If you make it too smooth, it's a bit too unreal here. And there's also the drips smoothness, so a lot of stuff that you can check here. Same with invert. If you wanted to invert the mask, remember it's just black and white what we're doing here, black and white and gray values, and inverting it will give you very different effects, so it depends on what you're after. I'm gonna just leave something like this and maybe make it a little bit less, because it might be a little strong. There is another way to make something blend out. I'll show you that in a moment. Maybe we'll leave it overemphasized like this. And you think, hey, I like the effect, but if I go and look at it together with my material, that's just too strong. I'd like for a little bit less green to be blended in. So this is, again, this is a little confusing, but it's on the material now. If you select the material, you can also, much like in Photoshop, tell Substance Painter how much or how little of this particular color should be blended in and with what blending option. And that happens by looking up this top menu here. These are all our channels. I'm using the base color, and on here I can now go and choose to blend this out a little bit. So this is going to not make any changes to the actual generator. It just blends less of the color onto the complete stack. So maybe something like, you know, maybe just a little bit like 70 might be nice. I think the generator itself is actually a little bit too strong. I can see in the window that this is applying a bit too much stuff. So I think I'm going to go back in here, click that, and go and maybe change the rust spreading a little bit so that we don't get too much of that. Yeah, something like that. And now I can still blend more or less of this in and see how much green I actually want. So I think subtlety probably works best, but again, we can change our mind later. So let's rename that layer and call that green leaks, or moss, or whatever you want to call it, and move on to the next layer, which will be a wear layer. So wear is something that you'll find on usually metal objects that have been handled a lot. So the edges might not look exactly like the material used to look like at one point. It'll reveal something that might have been underneath it. If you think of a sort of gold-plated statue that was really made of something like a cheaper alloy, and over time the gold on the edges where it was handled has worn off a little bit. That's what a wear generator does. And in our case, because it's not a metal object, I'm thinking the wear on a wall might be something like either plain white, or we can use our original material and reveal something of a different color variation on that. So let's go and make a duplicate on that, on the base color material, Control D, and then go and bring that to the top of the stack. And now we're basically back to where we started. But now let's go and apply some levels to this so that we can change the color or the contrast of this a little bit, make it a little bit, say, darker. Let's say there was a bit of a darker stone underneath it, and change the contrast a little bit. So maybe there was a different type of brickwork underneath this. Let's say that was it, and you can go and change the color in different ways as well. Give it a completely different color, use a different material altogether. I'm just going to use this, and I'm going to call that the darker matte. And now that this is on the top of the stack, once again, we're going to go and add a black mask to it so that it disappears for a moment, and then we're going to go and bring a generator back. Always the same principle almost, and we're going to go and grab one that's called, I believe there's a metal edge wear and fiberglass wear. So they're both okay. I think for our purposes we're going to use a metal edge wear. This one I don't think is going to look quite right, but yeah, metal is gonna be fine. So when we go and do that, it should now eventually show us some of the cracks that will appear. But because my material is already very busy, let me go and use my dummy layer again, slide it directly underneath here, enable it, just so that we can see what's happening here. So this is very subtle, but on the edges, this is stuff that's being revealed now in a different color, and that adds a really nice subtle variation to our wall, and that's part of aging, brickwork aging. So once again, in the Properties tab, you've got all kinds of adjustments here. You've got the wear level. This is going to wear or reveal more or less of the edges. Then there's a wear contrast. You can reveal it in different ways. And once again, triplanar is a different option. You can use the grunge amount, grunge scale, make it larger, make it smaller. So I think I might make the number smaller, but that leads to larger cracks here. Edge smoothness, how much away from the edges you want to reveal. And there's also the ambient occlusion masking, and that has an effect on the crevices. So ambient occlusion is something like whenever you have a crack or crevice, that's where naturally shadows would build up. That's where the light can't quite penetrate, and that is what ambient occlusion simulates. Curvature weight, does that do something? A little bit. So I think I might go and add my wear level, crank that up a little bit. So really what we're looking for is something very subtle. I really don't want it to look like this. I want to just reveal a little bit more of the brickwork underneath it in certain parts. So something maybe like this. So everything that's black is going to be from the regular material, but this is just going to add a little bit of detail to it. So let's say we're happy with this and disable our dummy layer to see what it looks like in conjunction with the rest of our material. This was without and this was with. So again, subtle, but it's exactly what we'd see on an aging or worn wall. Make it as strong or subtle as you like. Click the random button to see random variation of that. And that's another thing off our list, added to our worn wall here. There's one last thing I want to do, aside from perhaps save my project, which happens here. File, save as. I'm going to go and put this into my folder here. I'm going to call that Dirty Wall Demo. And that is to add some decal type objects to the front of the wall. So something that may have just brightened up the stone through, say calcium deposits or something like that. So for that, let's go and make ourselves another fill layer at the top of the stack. And once again, Alt select color to get a sort of a white color. You can make it whiter if you like, but I think the default white is going to work quite nicely because it's not 100% white. It's just like a light color. And in here, I'm going to go and apply a simple texture here in the base color channel. And I'm going to go and select something and just call it maybe dripping, something like that. Dripping, or you can find leakage, something like that. And pick any of these leakage or dripping bits and pieces here. Something that might look nice. If you hover over these, you'll get a preview. Let's see which one I'm going to use. Maybe this one here, the grunge leak large. I think that's going to be nice. There's also the grunge leak dirty, or maybe the grunge humidity. I think maybe that'll work. Grunge humidity or grunge leak large, one of these things. I'm going to use grunge humidity. I'm going to click that, and then it gets applied to the whole thing. And that's not really what we want. So right now it uses this texture and uses the object's UVs to just apply that texture everywhere. And that's not really what we want to use. So at the top here, then there is the projection. UV projection is exactly what we have right now, but you can change that over to something like warp projection, and then you'll be able to adjust it much like a decal. So select that, and then you'll see that you've got this little manipulator here, and you can now have something like a projection depth and blend it in where you want. So you might not want this on the window, so you can go and pull it off a little bit like this. Thankfully we have something like a square texture, but you can also go and change the scale of it a little bit. So Q switches this manipulator off and on, and then W, E, and R switch between positioning, if you wanted to put it in a different spot, or rotation, if you wanted to rotate it around, or scale it up in both directions or into one direction. So that's very powerful for positioning. So we're going to go and use it literally as it is and project it to the front. If you want to adjust the projection depth, if you want for this object to go deeper, you can do that. That's at the top here under projection depth. 0.1 is the default, but if you set it to deeper, then it'll go and get projected onto more of it. So it's basically exactly like a decal. So we're just going to go and blend that in with a decal here. So leaving the window out, and now we're going to use a trick that we use from Photoshop. In fact, here with this menu set to base color, because it's the base color value that we're adjusting, and instead of the normal blending mode, we're going to use something else. So you can either go blend this out, but that makes it all darker. We could use something like the multiply and then blend it out, or use something else like maybe screen or overlay. I think screen is going to work quite nicely. So again, this is very subtle without and with, but you can see these white patches here. In fact, they're not quite strong enough for me. So I'm just going to go to make those stronger. I can either adjust the levels to make the contrast harder, or I can just do the lazy trick and hit Control D on this layer and just duplicate it once or twice. And then I can see that now I get more white patches here. Let's go and put all these things together in a group, Control G, so that we have one overall slider to adjust them all with. Once you do that, the folder itself will switch itself to normal, and that looks pretty terrible. But if we set it to pass through, then it'll acknowledge whatever's happening underneath, and then you can also go and blend the overall intensity of that. So now that we have something much, much stronger, you can go and blend it in like that. So there we go. That's pretty much all our effects done. And just to recap, this is then maybe the calcification at the top here. You can put all kinds of other effects on this, but this gives you an idea of how to build up your layer stack. So this is the calcification on the top here. These are the darker cracks. I suppose we can call that cracks. What dummy layer we're going to ignore. This is sort of the green moss sort of infestation that we have here. And then we have the dirt on the window, and then we have the dirt on the wall. And then we have a base material that'll blend into all of this. The final thing, the final piece of the puzzle is how do we export this out and apply it to our object in Unreal Engine. Let's have a look at that. Control S to save everything. And then you can either hit Control Shift E, or you can go to File, Export Textures. And that'll now go and bring us to this crazy little menu here. This here is the default export path. If you click on it, a window will open that will show you where that is. You can make a copy of that path because we're going to need that in a moment. Or you can go to list of export and then check the open output directory. That'll just go and open up a browser window from which we can go and drag this in to Unreal Engine in a moment. This one was from a previous project, so I'm going to go and delete these two things because I can have this folder can be completely empty. And that's where our big textures are going to end up in. So if you just hit export, you're going to lose out on some of the settings that we can set on export, namely how large we want our textures to be. So perhaps on the size, we want to use 4K export if we want to do that. In fact, let's go and treat ourselves. 4K maps it is. Padding you can leave alone, but the output template, if you're working with Unreal Engine, should be set to there's a special thing here called UE Unreal Engine 4 Packed. That's what we can use. I mean, PBR metallic roughness will work, but I prefer this for more complex materials that do have metallic and roughness values. They're going to be packed into these maps, so you don't end up with 5 or 6 textures. You only end up with 2 or 3. So let's go and do that, and then head over to this default material thing here, which is essentially the material slot that we've used. Thankfully, our material only had 1. Otherwise, Substance Painter can has some problems with that. I haven't discussed that here. Same with UDIMs. If your source asset had UDIMs, then the workflow is going to be a little bit different. Here we can go and remove some of the things that we don't need. So we only really need the color. We don't need the metallic. We might want the normal, but we don't want anything emissive. So color and normal is what we brought in. Color and normal is what we're going to bring out. So untick everything else and then go and hit export. That will now go and bake those maps out, so we can apply them in Unreal Engine. And this is that window that gets populated with these 2 things here, so very good. Once it's done, hit Save Settings, and then go back into Unreal Engine. So since this is a new scene, I'm going to go and move this previous window over here, make a duplicate of that, and just have a look where that material instance is with the little icon here. That's it. So I'm going to go and make another instance of that, and I'm going to call it MI Dirty Wall Demo, and I'm going to make a new folder into which I'm going to call this Dirty Wall Demo as well. This is what we've done. I'm going to put this into here, move that here, also apply this to our wall here, very important. Nothing's changed because we haven't overwritten or imported the textures yet, but that's going to come next. I'm going to do this in this folder as well. I can either go to import and then navigate to my folder, just paste in the path you've had there, or just go and drag these things in from your other window directly into the content browser here. Both options will work. I'm going to hit open, and then Unreal Engine has a little think about this for a second, and now we have these 2 textures that we can now go and use in our material instance and override them. So let's go do that. Open the material instance and then have a look at the texture maps. There's the albedo and there's the normal, and if those are not ticked already, then tick them and go and slide your new textures into those things. So this goes into here, and then this normal goes into here. And that has applied that. And this is, after a couple of seconds, it's going to show us our handiwork inside of the viewport. So there we have it. This is now the same, that's very similar to what I've done before, almost looks identical with subtle variations. So if you build up a couple of these and then make a whole house of them, you can have a really nice look for something that looked very clean and bland, but now with added scratches and weathering damage. And then if you find this is a little bit too much, you can always go and tone the whole thing down, tone the whole stack down in Substance Painter. That is it. I hope this was helpful. I know it was a lot to take in, especially if you haven't worked with Substance Painter before, but if you practice this a couple of times, or like 50, 60 times, it really will grow on you. And especially if you have a lot of assets to weather and age, this is going to grow on you really quickly. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and I'm sure you can do it with Substance Painter. Take care. Bye-bye.